Literacy has become an attractive token, meaningless and helpless by itself, over possession of which entire societies, led by hotheads who should know better, contend for a time, perhaps years at a time, to destructive effect on all sides for the sake of a story. In other words, literacy is the Helen of Troy of the culture wars of our times, which have already lasted a good deal longer than the original Trojan Wars, if they occurred. As for Helen herself, what she thought of her various abductions, suitors, and husbands remains uncertain. Not least because, of course, she's an artifact of story and mythology, not history. As with other manifestations of culture, it's the uses to which something is put and who uses them that count, even when the artifact in question is a social institution like literacy rather than a personalization like Helen. Indeed, both Helen and literacy stand for impersonal forces, social tensions, historical transformations, and collective dynamics. In Helen's case, the end of the age of divine-born heroes. In literacy's case, the promise of heroic futures to come. The persistent and sustaining story of literacy for its proponents. Both tokens stand for forces that they themselves can't control. One of them is personified in the myth of the Trojan Wars, the other kicked about as a political football in the culture wars. Understanding that literacy has a mythic dimension is as important as knowing that Helen's mythic status, the face that launched 1,000 ships, explains hers. Stories in the Murdoch press about literacy are more decisive than whatever reality lies behind them, be it abduction or rape, prize or power. So we'll get on with that. We need to think about Greeks bearing gifts. As scholars of culture, media, and communication, we need to identify what the uses of literacy are as something more than a rhetorical token in adversarial politics, and to expand what counts as literacy beyond the current packaged form, to expand where state coercion and control over wayward populations require the compulsory abduction of children to strange places where they must spend the next 10 years while others fight over their still uncertain futures. If literacy is our culture's Helen, then schools are its Troy, their topless towers seemingly impregnable, but both sides of the argument seem to agree, doomed. Mass literacy is reduced to costly signalling, the ability to pay for it and to endure the disutility and waste that qualifies you as a docile employee, while the real market is not the content or the quality of your literacy, but the brand power of the school or college in which you endured it. In The Case Against Education, libertarian warrior Brian Kaplan draws the inevitable conclusion. He says, stop throwing good money after bad, cut education budgets, shift the financial burden of education from taxpayers to students and their families. Unquote. So literacy becomes a token in a political tug of war. The real struggle is between state regulation and deregulation by the market. Ground gained by either side may change who wins control over the prize, which, like Helen in Homer, seems to be what they're fighting over, but has absolutely no effect on the outcome. So literacy is generally accepted as a foundational social technology of modernity. Its definition has become broad and abstract in order to apply it across different technologies, digital as well as analog, different symbol systems, mathematical and audio-visual as well as alphabetic, and different languages and cultures, global as well as national. Literacy is a proxy for development and for progress towards wider access to education across the world. In turn, education is seen as the chief means for poverty eradication globally. Improving literacy through education underlies the UNESCO's Sustainable Development Goals set in 2015, and there's a UNESCO definition of literacy right there. This is why critics see it see it as only a portal to something of greater value. I'm sorry, I'm going too fast. However, the transactional approach has never seemed sufficiently open, being all too easily bent to the will of firms and state authorities. Instrumental literacy encourages neither radical nor unpredictable uses. In Umberto Eco's schema of open works and closed works, instrumental literacy confines its users to closed works, teaching populations to comply with instructions, pay taxes, use business technologies, or consume ideological goods. And this is why critics see it as only a portal to something of greater value. They want critical literacy. Here, the reader has to do some work to identify and assess the credibility and quality of any cultural production. Can you tell the difference between compelling art and the con artist? Can you tell knowledge from ideology, truth-seeking from attention-seeking, and the differences, if any, among fact, fiction, fraud, and fake news? Here, literacy combines scientific and political skepticism with critical discrimination, a taste for originality, and astute creativity in open-ended uses of literacy. Richard Hoggart's influential book of that name, Richard Hoggart's influential book of that name took for granted that if mass literacy goes no further than engagement with the closed texts of television and the flicks, pulp fiction and salacious magazines, then this is a useless kind of literacy. Hoggart argued that popular literacy left ordinary people intellectually and politically unemancipated. He wanted to encourage uses of literacy that would arm them against being conned by what they read in the papers, and to enable them to use literacy for their own imaginative life, based on class, community, and critique. In a sense, this was also a developmental agenda, albeit not instrumentalist and based on class rather than nation. So it's not jobs and GDP that he's after. In fact, Hoggart himself went on to take a top position at UNESCO. So he's a developmentalist and a progressive. He wanted to transform what he called the overwhelming immobility of British working class lives, and what he memorably described as the damp putting up with things, where intellectual emancipation and the freedom to express different kinds of truth was inhibited by education, by schooling, by literacy. Which is what that quote says, yes. So critical literacy was political from the start, not only opposing the status quo and the establishment, but also opposing popular culture in which the working class was immersed, even as it fragmented and changed along with new patterns of work, consumer culture, and post-colonial migration. So critical literacy, despite his own critique, Hoggart discovered in performing it on popular culture that there was a previously unexamined world where purposeless literacy, Americanized and popularized for mass consumption, was not useless, but a resource. The very apparatus that he found unacceptable was gaining traction with young people in ways he couldn't see. He was notoriously impatient with youth, especially boys, loitering in milk bars, jigging about to American music on the jukebox. Here they are, quoting him, saying, "Ground between the millstones of technology and democracy, the directionless and tamed helots of a machine-minding class." But what did, he says, they're not simply a social oddity, they're a portent. But what did they portend? Here, Hoggart missed something. He missed that educated, critical opinion has struggled with ever since. And that is that play, understood here as conspicuous time wasting, daydreaming, mischief, choosing to adopt something because it annoys other people, and so on. These are the crucible of creative innovation through new forms of sociality, solidarity, and radical opportunity, using the very texts at hand from the jukebox as open works in Echo's sense. So, in other words, leisured purposelessness with new technologies and mass entertainments dismissed by Hoggart as a peculiarly thin and pallid form of dissipation, a sort of spiritual dry rot amid the odour of boiled milk, that's Hoggart, can be very far from useless. The subsequent youth cultures of the 1960s proved, not only commercially in the global music business, but also politically in insurrectionary and alternative lifestyles. So Hoggart wanted to reform traditional working class culture, but the jukebox boys and the girls wanted to rock and roll. The youngsters were literate in ways that previous technologies of mass organisation, including the labour and union movements, were very slow to recognise, much less to adopt, from protest songs to helter-skelter, creating new but different myths. You can see there's a whole paper in that, but we haven't got time, so. Since then, literacy has expanded not only around the world, but as measured by UNESCO, but conceptually too, in what I think may be three main ways. First, what I'm calling hyphenated multiliteracies. Literacy was not confined to reading or writing. It extended to audiovisual, media, and digital literacies, expanding to other senses, such as emotional literacy, health literacy, financial literacy, cultural literacy, and so on, all of which you'll find books about. Second, disciplinary bias, where literacy could refer to quite different things depending on your training and method, ranging from history, literature, and linguistics in the old humanities, via cultural, gender, and subaltern studies in the new humanities, to scientific approaches in quantitative disciplines with methodological individualism, like psychology and economics. They all produce a different kind of literacy. And third, the political hot potato. Literacy, what it's for, who should be in charge, how to teach it, for what purpose, is captured as a trophy for the winners in the culture wars. So what about the culture wars? Let's have a look at them. I'm calling them the phonic wars. Some of you may understand what that refers to. I must admit it's a mystery to me, but there is something called phonics. About which the Australian gets very exercised, so I don't know why. The last of these alternatives, the culture wars, has had a decisive restructuring effect on the others, so that now you can't approach the topic historically by discipline or medium except through partisan politics. So literacy is still not open, either as a field of study or as a practical skill. One of the most toxic examples has flourished in the Australian culture wars, lasting for at least as long as the Trojan Wars, and championed by the Australian, the Spectator, the IPA, what is the IPA? The Institute for Public Affairs, and something else. The Centre for Independent Studies, Kevin Donnelly. Anybody not from Australia won't understand a word of this, and rightly so. It doesn't matter, but it is the chosen ground of the culture wars. And as you can see, there is such a thing as Western civilization, which is upheld by somebody called Jones, former rugby coach. And if you don't do phonics, then that's the end of Western civilization. It says here. Somebody called Bella Dabrera is the director of Western Civilization Research at the IPA, the Institute for Public Affairs, and she appears very often in the Australian media, that is to say in the Australian, the Telegraph, and on the IPA website, occasionally in the Spectator. And she says things like what you see on the screen. This was last year. Where we begin to understand that there are types of literacy that are okay and types of literacy that are not okay. So there is an argument about using literacy to become politically active or returning to the fundamentals. So it's not only a parochial storm in a teacup. Ian Bogost, for example, has recently argued in The Atlantic that what various media literacies teach their users is now a partisan issue in the US as well. It's a good article. And it brings us inevitably to video games. What do video games teach? Well, apparently they teach people how to be aggressive, violent, use guns to kill children. So teaching children to kill children or Western civilization. You get it, don't you? As if Western civilization doesn't teach children to kill children. We won't go there. The people who say such things, the people who read and recycle such notions about literacy, they're not randomly distributed among the population. This is Bogost now, as he shows in his article. If you're a Republican, NRA supporter, games cause violence, but if you're a Democrat or gun control supporter, then violence is caused by something else entirely, white supremacy. And those things do not overlap. In fact, the rift goes very deep, beyond the reach of reason and evidence, and not just in the USA. Literacy has tribalized into non-overlapping adversarial we groupings that only interact through competition and mutual hostility, not by translating ideas and knowledge and the competence to use them from one knowledge domain or group to another. The evolution of knowledge systems has produced two kinds of knowledge at macro level, apart from all the specialisms: what I call connective knowledge, which is tribal, organized at personal scale, finding new impetus in social media, and productive or armed knowledge, which operates at institutional or mesoscale and is a complex production of social groups of various kinds. So it's not an individualist behavior, it's a social organization. Armed knowledge is literate, print-based science, the novel, journalism, have all been able to expand the frontiers of that kind of knowledge to the furthest reaches of the cosmos, human imagination, and public affairs at planetary scale. Am I catching? Oh, wrong thing. So where pre-modern tribal groups could get by on connective knowledge, later monarchical imperial societies also needed productive knowledge as well as connective, so the two coexist. The productive type requires a combination of three elements: complex organization, which is bureaucracy, binding ideologies, in most cases gods or kings, and their contemporary homologies, and what historian sociologist called Milesevich calls micro-solidarity, or mateship, as it's known in Australia, among specialized expert units, the kind of bonding and connectivity among small groups that can turn ordinary citizens into people willing to kill other people. So these elements work together to abstract knowledge from local context and use it to further the interests of macro-scale systems, typically to defend states and religions against invasion from intruders with ever more lethal weaponry, and to spur economic development and growth. This is why such knowledge is both productive, used to invent new things, and armed, used to repel intruders. There are obvious connections or overlaps between this model and a more familiar one, certainly in cultural studies, derived from Ong, McLuhan, Goody and Watt, and so on back in the 60s, on the cultural consequences of orality and literacy. However, the primitivist idea that once we lived in oral culture, but now we live in literate culture, is not sustainable. Important components of modern life remain oral: family interaction, gangs, certain trades and rituals are conducted without writing. Even where writing is used, the practical mode of thought may remain oral, now among leadership elites as well as users, but connective knowledge also requires literacy, the internet, social media, and any interaction augmented by mobile devices. So orality and literacy are co-produced, is what I'm getting at. In that context, partisan knowledge in the hands of contemporary political populism has learnt to exploit this type of connective and ubiquitous literacy, e.g. where a tweeting president uses strongly oral, tribal, connective means to conduct statecraft and counters scientific skepticism with skepticism about science, dubbing modern literate institutional and productive knowledge as fake news, a hoax, the Washington swamp, etc., making things up to suit his own narrative arc and pressuring productive state agencies to fall in line with the Sharpie track, as with the Sharpie track of a recent hurricane, which I'm sure you all know about. Of course, it was too late. Hurricane Dorian was clearly a Democrat and refused the instructions of the Sharpie. Okay. Historian Peter Turchin, analysing long-run data, concludes that periods of luxury and extreme inequality promote extremes of intra-elite competition within elites, not between elites and classes, and conflict as well. Simultaneously, norms of cooperation and collective action are eroded. On the other hand, social well-being declines as wealth inequality increases, and the state itself is vulnerable to capture by ideologies of untrammeled individualism, two examples of which I'm just quoting from his work. This diagram is Turchin's, not mine, and it's very complicated, so if you want to look at it, check my slides later. But what it basically says is the higher social inequality, the lower social well-being in American history over the past 200 years. Very interesting analytic data from what he calls cliodynamics, historical dynamics. So how to keep disparate and conflicted societies together? Current trends suggest that although surveillance, authoritarian control, and the erosion of mass privacy are ascendant in both public and private sector enterprise, social polarization and instability are still on the increase. In fact, Turchin's data indicate that sooner or later the pendulum swings, he predicts, in 2020, and he did that prediction in 2013, long before Trump came on the scene. So check, we can test his cliodynamic method in next year. Is this an argument for a return to consensus, to greater senses of social well-being rather than wealth inequality in the near future, or is it an argument for increasing polarization of society? Well, the question remains organized around literacy. The consensus appears to be emergent around what literacy should be for. So in the 19th century, as Harvey Graff, the historian of literacy, has pointed out, the first mass literacy was only promoted to the extent that it satisfied particular social and imperial goals set by the people who ran schools rather than by the people who attended them. But no further. You can see the quote on the slide. It seems that such constrained, controlled literacy, where for properly schooled and morally restrained populations, is still the goal of the frontline culture warriors like the IPA and News Corp. So this is a 19th century, This is a 19th century ideology, I'm doing it again, that remains very active in certain political discourses. So this is Bella Cabrera again, suggesting that active politicization is the wrong kind of literacy, and active school children learning from their lessons and doing something about it can be dismissed as kids dodging their lessons. Oops. Okay, so if schooling has been captured by literacy is deemed good for teaching ideology of individualism, it's not good for collective values and action. The purportedly libertarian IPA and the supposedly free market News Limited become the cheer squad for an authoritarian partisan politics. Finishing with the quote that they approve of, and I'm sure you've heard, Prime Minister Scott Morrison is spot on when he says there should be less activism and more learning in the classroom. So if literacy has been captured as an Althusserian ideological state apparatus, then where is the pressure for change going to come from? Turchin's historical model provides the answer. Elites only tire of their inter-elite competition after a period of incessant violence and disorder. Counterintuitively, more cooperative modes of governing and hope for social order are triggered by political activism and instability. It seems that open literacy and social responsibility are insurrectionary forces, made more urgent by impending climate and environmental catastrophe. So, it was obvious I was going to get here, wasn't it? Can open literacy connect scientific traditions of productive knowledge with group-making solidarity of connective knowledge to promote social responsibility for the planet and not just for the home nation or class? A glimmer of hope comes from the margins, uniting open access, open science, and open knowledge with activism among such self-organizing groups as Schools Strike for Climate, Extinction Rebellion, etc., and many others. Can that model be extended to whole populations across demographic borders at global scale for social innovation, instead of confining literacy as a mere instrument for securing profit, power, mass persuasion, and surveillance? Of course, the answer must rewrite stories or myth as well as history. Deliverance won't come from within the walled fortresses themselves, but from outsiders who sail across the world to change everything, except that now the figure that you might recognize as Helen is no longer a trophy, but a leader, a 16-year-old autistic girl who catalyzes a transformed future to make America and the world Greta again. How is this insurrectionary mode of literacy, how this insurrectionary mode of literacy works out in practice and what it's up against is the theme of our symposium. So thank you very much.